Imagine watching something take off that shouldn't be able to fly, not because it lacks power, but because of pure logic. It's so large it looks like a floating city, so heavy that even the water itself seems to hesitate before letting it move forward, and so strange that when it finally does move, no one is quite sure whether they're witnessing an airplane or a historical anomaly. This colossus wasn't made of aluminum or steel, it was made of wood. In the middle of a wartime era, when metal was synonymous with power, the United States bet on building the largest airplane in the world using a material everyone considered obsolete. An aerial monster born from scarcity, urgency, and an almost excessive ambition. They called it the Spruce Goose. A nickname that sounds like a joke, an exaggeration, something that can't be taken seriously. But behind that name was a real project, funded, built, and pushed to the very limits of what was possible. An airplane so large it seemed impossible, and so expensive it seemed unjustifiable. It flew only once, just a few seconds, and yet, decades later, its story continues to spark debate, disbelief, and fascination. Because the Spruce Goose wasn't just an airplane, it was an idea taken to the extreme, a desperate answer to a gigantic problem, and above all, a demonstration of what happens when engineering, ego, and historical urgency collide at the same point. Before starting this video, remember to subscribe and leave a like. It all began with a need that allowed no room for error. In the middle of a global war, the United States faced a silent but deadly problem. Transporting massive numbers of troops and supplies across the ocean was dangerously inefficient. Enemy submarines turned every crossing into a game of Russian roulette. Ships sunk, lives lost, resources wasted. The traditional solution wasn't working. Something different was needed, something that would avoid the ocean by going over it. The idea was simple in appearance and absurd in practice. Build an aircraft capable of carrying enormous loads, crossing the Atlantic in a single trip, and doing so without relying on vulnerable maritime routes. An aircraft that could take off from water, land on water, and move what no other machine could move. The problem was size. To achieve this, the aircraft would have to be gigantic, far larger than anything that had ever flown before. And that's where the first real obstacle emerged. There wasn't enough metal. The war was devouring aluminum at a brutal pace. Every rivet was destined for fighters, bombers, and already proven aircraft. There was no room for experimentation. Then, someone proposed the unthinkable, using wood. Not ordinary wood, but laminated, treated structures engineered to withstand extreme stresses. An elegant technical solution, born out of necessity. The result would be an enormous aircraft, light for its size, and in theory, capable of fulfilling its mission. But this project did not fall into the hands of cautious engineers or conservative committees. It landed in the hands of an obsessive, perfectionist figure, convinced that limits existed to be ignored. Someone who never accepted no for an answer and was willing to stake his entire reputation on a single idea. From the very first blueprint, the project was controversial. Too big, too expensive, too slow to build, too different. As the war moved forward, the airplane kept growing, and so did the doubts. To some, it was a visionary solution. To others, a monumental mistake disguised as genius. But no one could deny one thing. If it managed to fly, it would change the rules forever. And if it didn't, it would become one of the largest and most expensive failures in the history of aviation. The Spruce Goose hadn't even touched the water yet, and it was already trapped between the promise of the impossible and the weight of expectations that threatened to crush it before takeoff. As the project progressed, the Spruce Goose stopped being just a technical solution and became a political problem. What had begun as an urgent response to the war started attracting attention for all the wrong reasons. Time passed, costs rose, and the aircraft still hadn't flown. Each passing month raised the same increasingly uncomfortable question. Why build an airplane for a war that was advancing faster than its own development? Pressure mounted from every direction. The government demanded results. Critics spoke of waste. Engineers struggled against limits no one had faced before. Designing something this large didn't just require new calculations, it also meant inventing manufacturing processes that didn't yet exist. Nothing was standard. Every component had to be designed from scratch. Every test revealed a new problem. The aircraft wasn't just enormous, it was an entire system built out of scale, which made it slow, fragile, and extraordinarily expensive. Meanwhile, the war was approaching its end. Existing technologies were improving, ships were better protected, routes were adjusted. The urgency that had justified the project began to fade, but the Spruce Goose could no longer be stopped. It had gone too far. It had consumed too many resources. Canceling it would have meant admitting a monumental mistake. Thus, the project became trapped in a dangerous paradox. It was no longer necessary, yet it could not be abandoned. The figure behind the aircraft grew increasingly isolated. He defended the project with a mix of pride and obsession. For him, it was no longer just about fulfilling a military function, but about proving that the impossible could be achieved. Every criticism was seen as a personal attack, every doubt as a betrayal. Public hearings began to question the project. Explanations were demanded. Proof was required. The aircraft still hadn't flown, but it was already on trial. For many, the Spruce Goose had become the perfect symbol of an idea that had grown beyond its original purpose. And yet, construction continued. The wooden giant slowly took shape, piece by piece, inside hangars built specifically to contain it. Its size could no longer be hidden. It was impossible to ignore. Even incomplete, it seemed to defy the logic of aviation. The world watched, waiting for a conclusion. Either it would fly and silence everyone, or it would become the definitive proof that some ideas, no matter how bold, arrive too late. And when it was finally ready to face the water, the context had completely changed. The war was over. The Spruce Goose was about to take off, in a world that no longer needed it. When the Spruce Goose was finally completed, it was no longer a promise of war, but a historical anomaly. The world had changed too quickly. What had been conceived as an urgent solution now felt like an experiment out of time. And yet, there was one question no one could ignore. Would it fly? The day of the test was not designed to make history. There were no grand announcements or official celebrations. There was skepticism, waiting cameras, and a silence heavy with doubt. For many, the outcome was already written. They believed the giant wooden aircraft would never leave the water. The airplane began to move slowly, gliding across the surface as if unsure of its own existence. Every meter increased the tension. The weight was immense. The wings seemed too large even for the sky. The engines roared, pushing a structure that defied all precedent. Then it happened. The Spruce Goose lifted off. Not spectacularly or for long, but enough to shatter a belief that had already turned into certainty. It separated from the water, remained airborne for a few seconds, and moved forward as if the sky itself, surprised, had decided to grant it a chance. That brief moment changed everything. Not because it proved commercial viability or military usefulness, but because it proved it was possible. Against logic, against ridicule, and against time, the largest aircraft ever built had flown. But the victory was fleeting. The moment it touched the water again, it became clear there would be no second act. There would be no mass production, no fleets crossing oceans. The flight was not the beginning of something new, but the end of an argument. It had arrived too late. The world no longer needed a wooden colossus. The war was over. Priorities had shifted. Aviation was moving toward faster, smaller, more efficient designs. The Spruce Goose no longer fit that logic. What remained was a strange feeling, not that of total failure, but not quite triumph either. It was a technical achievement without a practical purpose, a "yes, it can be done" that arrived when it no longer mattered. And that is, perhaps, the most tragic part of its story, because the Spruce Goose did not fall due to a lack of engineering. It fell under the weight of time. The speed at which the world moves once a crisis ends, and how little it forgives ideas that arrive late, no matter how extraordinary they are. The giant had proven it could fly, but no one was waiting to see it do so. After that brief flight, the Spruce Goose was left suspended in a kind of historical limbo. It wasn't an outright failure, but neither was it a success that could be replicated. It had proven just enough to silence its critics, while at the same time proving that it no longer had a place in the world that was emerging. The wooden giant was stored, protected, and maintained under almost ceremonial conditions, not because there was a plan to use it, but because abandoning it would have meant admitting that everything had been in vain. Its creator refused to allow it to deteriorate. Every detail had to remain intact, as if it might take off again at any moment. But that moment never came. Over the years, the Spruce Goose became an uncomfortable symbol. It represented a dangerous mix of brilliance, stubbornness, and poor timing. It was proof that engineering could push physical limits, but could not control historical context. As aviation moved toward more powerful engines, metal fuselages, and unimaginable speeds, the Colossus remained motionless, frozen in an era that no longer existed. Each new innovation made its design seem even more out of place, not obsolete, but misaligned. For many, the aircraft became a silent lesson, a warning about projects that grow so large they stop responding to a real need, about ideas that continue by inertia even after the world has changed direction. And yet, it also inspired admiration, because few projects dared to go so far. Few ignored so many established rules. Few proved, even if only for seconds, that logic can bend when ambition is great enough. The Spruce Goose became a monument to that ambition. It didn't fly, but it commanded respect. It served no function, but it told a story. The story of a moment when someone refused to accept limits, even when everything suggested it was already too late. And perhaps that is why it was never dismantled, never reduced to parts, never completely forgotten. It remained there, enormous and silent, reminding everyone that progress does not always follow clean, orderly lines. Sometimes it advances through spectacular mistakes, through bets that don't turn out as expected, through machines that prove something fundamental, even if they don't change the world directly. The Spruce Goose did not transform aviation, but it left behind an open question. How many extraordinary ideas fail not because they are impossible, but because the right moment has already passed? And that question brings us to the end of its story. As the years went by, the Spruce Goose stopped being judged for what it failed to achieve and began to be remembered for what it dared to attempt. It no longer mattered that it had flown only once, or that time had erased its practical usefulness. Its value shifted from the military and technical realm to the symbolic one. Because the Spruce Goose was not built to be reasonable, it was built to exist in an extreme moment, when the entire world was willing to accept unthinkable solutions if there was even the slightest chance of changing the course of a war. In that context, the idea of a colossal wooden aircraft was not madness, it was a gamble. And like any gigantic gamble, it carried an uncomfortable truth. It could fail spectacularly. The aircraft ultimately became a living relic, not of a war, but of a mindset. It represented an era in which size, audacity, and individual will could push projects beyond any logical limit. An era that believed that with enough resources and determination, any problem could be solved. But the Spruce Goose also revealed the other side of that belief. It showed that engineering does not exist in a vacuum, that proving something is possible is not enough if the world no longer needs it. That time, more than physics, is the final judge of every great idea. For decades, the aircraft remained motionless, preserved almost with reverence, not as a machine ready to fly, but as a tangible reminder of an ambition that went too far, or arrived too late. Its size still inspired awe, its presence still commanded silence, but its purpose had changed forever. It was no longer a solution, it was a question. A question about how many projects are born from fear, how many from pride, and how many from real necessity. About how many ideas are pushed beyond their original purpose because stopping would mean admitting a mistake, and about how often we confuse the extraordinary with the necessary. The Spruce Goose did not fail as an airplane, it failed as an answer. But in that failure, it left behind a lesson that still holds true. Progress does not always move in a straight line, nor does it reward the biggest, the most expensive, or the boldest. Sometimes, progress simply moves on, and leaves behind even the most impressive ideas. The largest airplane in the world flew only once, and that was enough to prove that even giants can be left without a sky. As always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. See you in the next video.